Day 1, they laughed behind her back. Too small, too soft, too civilian. The sun blistered, the mud swallowed her boots, and the push-ups tore at muscles she didn't know she had. But she never quit. Not when her arms gave out. Not when the boys rolled their eyes. Not even when her knees bled. And on day 7, as she dragged a 200-pound sandbag across the finish line, face streaked with sweat and fire, the drill sergeant, arms crossed, broke his silence and clapped. From which corner of the world are you watching this story today? If you believe that true strength isn't measured by size, but by spirit, consider subscribing for more stories that prove determination can overcome any obstacle. The scorching Texas sun had barely crested the horizon when Echo Company assembled on the gravel parade ground at Fort Hood, their desert camouflage uniforms already showing dark patches of perspiration despite the early hour. At 0545 hours, the Advanced Individual Training Platoon stood in formation, 47 soldiers beginning their second week of intensive military occupational specialty training. Among them, standing third from the left in the back row, was Private First Class Sarah Chun, 5 feet 2 inches of barely contained determination wrapped in a uniform that seemed designed for someone considerably larger. Staff Sergeant Marcus Iron Washington surveyed his platoon with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent 12 years transforming civilians into soldiers. His weathered face, marked by deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan, held no expression as he noted the subtle dynamics already emerging within the group. The larger male soldiers had unconsciously positioned themselves toward the front, their body language radiating confidence born of physical advantage. The smaller recruits, including the 3 women in the platoon, clustered toward the back with the nervous energy of people proving themselves in territory where their presence remained controversial. Today marks the beginning of your real training, Washington announced, his voice carrying across the formation with the authority that came from years of command presence. Everything you've done until now was preparation. Today we find out who has what it takes to wear the uniform and who's been wasting everyone's time. Private Chin felt 46 pairs of eyes avoid looking in her direction, though she could sense the collective skepticism that surrounded her like humidity. During the previous week's initial processing and orientation, she'd overheard countless whispered conversations questioning whether someone her size belonged in combat arms training. The doubt wasn't malicious. Most of her fellow soldiers seemed genuinely concerned about her safety, but it was omnipresent and exhausting. First exercise is the Combat Fitness Assessment, Washington continued, consulting his clipboard with military precision. Modified to reflect the physical demands you'll face in operational environments. This isn't about passing minimum standards. This is about proving you can carry your weight when someone else's life depends on your performance. The assessment course stretched across 2 miles of varied terrain behind the main training facility. Obstacle walls, rope climbs, tire runs, low crawls through simulated combat conditions, and finally a team carry exercise that required pairs of soldiers to transport 200-pound sandbags across a quarter-mile finish line. Washington had designed the course based on his combat experience in Mosul, where physical strength often meant the difference between mission success and casualty evacuation. Private Chun adjusted her equipment harness and checked her boot laces with the methodical attention to detail that had characterized her approach to every challenge since enlisting 6 months earlier. At 22, she'd left a comfortable job in software development to pursue military service. Driven by motivations she'd never successfully explained to family members who couldn't understand her decision to abandon financial security for institutional uncertainty. Chun called Specialist Rodriguez from the formation beside her. You sure you want to attempt the full course? No shame in requesting the modified version until you build up more strength. She appreciated Rodriguez's concern. He'd been one of the few soldiers willing to include her in informal conversations during their first week, but his suggestion reflected the same protective instinct that she'd been fighting since basic training. Everyone wanted to help her succeed by lowering expectations, not realizing that reduced standards felt more limiting than encouraging. I'll run the standard course, Chun replied quietly, her voice carrying just enough volume to reach Washington's ears. Same as everyone else. The staff sergeant's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes that might have been approval or might have been resignation. In 12 years of training soldiers, he'd seen plenty of determination that exceeded physical capability, and he'd learned that good intentions couldn't substitute for practical limitations when bullets started flying. The first obstacle was a 12-foot wall with minimal handholds, designed to simulate urban combat environments where soldiers needed to scale buildings under fire. The larger soldiers attacked it with confidence, using their height and reach to advantage while Chun watched and calculated angles, searching for technique that could compensate for physical disadvantage. When her turn came, she approached the wall with methodical precision, using momentum and leverage rather than brute strength to propel herself upward. Her first attempt failed 6 feet from the top when her grip strength gave out, sending her sliding back to the starting position while scattered chuckles rippled through the group of waiting soldiers. "Time," Washington called, consulting his stopwatch. "Next soldier." "Request permission to try again, Staff Sergeant," Chin said, breathing hard but maintaining the respectful tone that military courtesy required. Washington studied her face, noting the dirt streaks and the beginning of what would become impressive bruising on her forearms. "You get 1 attempt per obstacle, Private. Those are the rules." "Roger, Staff Sergeant," Chin replied, falling back into formation though her jaw tightened with frustration that she worked to keep from showing. The rope climb proved equally challenging, where soldiers like Private Morrison, 6 feet 4 inches of former high school football player, could muscle their way up through arm strength alone. Chen had to rely on technique that required perfect coordination between feet and hands. She made it halfway before her grip failed, leaving her suspended for a moment before sliding down the rope with friction burns that would require medical attention later. By the tire run, a brutal quarter-mile sprint while dragging weighted obstacles behind them, Chun had fallen to the back of the group. Her smaller stature meant shorter strides and less power generation, while her lighter weight provided no advantage when momentum was key to maintaining speed across uneven terrain. "Pick it up, Chun," called Private Davis from somewhere ahead of her, his voice carrying encouragement rather than mockery. "You can do this." The support meant more than he probably realized, but it also highlighted her isolation within the group. No one doubted her effort or questioned her determination, but everyone seemed to view her success as improbable rather than inevitable. She was being cheered like an underdog in a contest where second place might mean someone died in combat. The low crawl through simulated battlefield conditions proved to be Chin's strongest event. Her smaller profile allowed her to move through obstacles that slowed larger soldiers, and her software development background had taught her to analyze problems systematically rather than attacking them through force alone. For the first time that day, she finished in the middle of the pack rather than bringing up the rear. "Better," Washington acknowledged as she emerged from the final crawl obstacle, covered in mud but moving with steady rhythm. "Now we see what you're really made of." The team carry exercise required soldiers to pair up and transport 200-pound sandbags across a quarter-mile course that included hills, stream crossings, and additional obstacles designed to simulate evacuating wounded personnel under combat conditions. The weight was significant enough that even large soldiers struggled, and the distance ensured that cardiovascular fitness mattered as much as raw strength. "Chun, you're with Morrison," Washington announced, pairing the smallest soldier with the largest, a combination that drew nervous laughter from other members of the platoon who understood the practical implications of mismatched partners. Morrison approached her with obvious concern, his expression reflecting the protective instinct that most of her male colleagues seemed to feel. "Look, Sarah, I can handle most of the weight if you just help with balance and navigation. No need for you to burn yourself out trying to carry more than you can manage." The offer was kindly meant, but Chun recognized it as another version of the reduced expectations that had been following her throughout training. Morrison was trying to help her succeed by ensuring she didn't fail, not understanding that success achieved through accommodation felt hollow rather than empowering. "I'll carry my share," Chun replied, positioning herself at one end of the sandbag while Morrison took the other. Just like everyone else. What followed was 27 minutes of the most physically demanding experience in Chen's life. The sandbag seemed to gain weight with every step, the straps cut into her shoulders despite her protective gear, and her legs trembled with exhaustion by the halfway point. Morrison carried more than his proportional share despite her protests, but she refused to let him bear the entire burden. At the 15-minute mark, she stumbled and fell, the sandbag's momentum pulling Morrison down with her. Around them, other teams continued past while Chin struggled to regain her footing on legs that no longer seemed entirely under her control. "Chun, let me handle this," Morrison said, genuine concern replacing his earlier patronizing protectiveness. "You're going to hurt yourself." "No," Chin gasped, forcing herself upright and repositioning her grip on the sandbag straps. "We finish together or we don't finish." The final quarter-mile stretched ahead like an impossible distance. Chin's vision had narrowed to tunnel focus. Her breathing came in ragged gasps that burned her throat, and her muscles screamed with exhaustion that went beyond anything she'd experienced during civilian fitness activities. But with each painful step, something crystallized in her understanding of what military service demanded and what she was willing to sacrifice to meet those demands. Morrison, despite his size advantage, was also struggling. The extended duration and uneven weight distribution had challenged his cardiovascular system in ways that pure strength training hadn't prepared him for. For the first time since they'd been paired, they were suffering equally, united by shared exhaustion rather than separated by physical disparity. 50 meters, Morrison panted, his voice strained but encouraging. "We've got this." Chin couldn't waste energy on verbal response, but she nodded and adjusted her grip for the final push. Around them, other soldiers who had finished their own attempts had gathered to watch, their faces reflecting a mixture of concern and admiration that she was too focused to notice. Staff Sergeant Washington stood at the finish line, stopwatch in hand, an expression unreadable. In 12 years of conducting similar exercises, he'd seen soldiers quit, fail, and occasionally transcend their apparent limitations through sheer determination. Chin's attempt represented something different. Not just individual effort, but a test of whether someone obviously unsuited for physical demands could find ways to contribute meaningfully to unit mission success. The final 20 meters required every reserve of strength and willpower that Chin possessed. Her legs threatened to buckle with each step, her grip on the sandbag straps felt increasingly tenuous, and her vision was beginning to gray around the edges from exhaustion and oxygen debt. But Morrison's presence beside her provided psychological anchor that kept her moving forward when stopping would have been easier. 10 meters. 5 meters. The finish line. Chun and Morrison crossed together, their forward momentum carrying them several steps past the designated endpoint before Chin's legs finally gave out completely. She collapsed to her knees, the sandbag falling beside her, while Morrison bent over gasping for air, but still standing. For a moment, the assembled soldiers were silent. Then, unexpectedly, Staff Sergeant Washington began to clap, a slow, deliberate rhythm that acknowledged effort rather than celebrating achievement. One by one, the other members of Echo Company joined him, their applause growing in volume and enthusiasm as they recognized what they had witnessed. "Outstanding effort, both of you," Washington said, when the applause subsided. Morrison, "Good teamwork and leadership under pressure." "Chun," he paused, studying her face as she struggled to regain her composure. That was the kind of determination that wins wars. The praise felt surreal to Chun, who had expected either failure or patronizing encouragement rather than genuine recognition from someone whose approval she'd been working to earn. Around her, fellow soldiers were offering congratulations and support that reflected changed perceptions rather than protective sympathy. "Damn, Chun," said Private Davis, extending his hand to help her to her feet. "I was wrong about you. That was hardcore." Over the following days, Chin's status within Echo Company underwent subtle but significant transformation. She remained the smallest and physically weakest member of the platoon, but her performance during the team carry exercise had demonstrated qualities that couldn't be measured through conventional fitness assessments. Soldiers who had previously treated her with protective concern began including her in conversations about tactics and strategy, recognizing that her analytical approach to problem-solving offered perspectives that pure physical capability couldn't provide. More importantly, Chin had proven to herself that success in military service didn't require matching her male colleagues' physical achievements. It required finding ways to contribute meaningfully despite limitations, and maintaining standards that honored the institution rather than seeking accommodations that diminished expectations. "The thing about combat," Staff Sergeant Washington explained during a classroom session on small unit leadership, is that it doesn't care about your physical advantages or disadvantages. It cares about whether you can perform your mission when everything goes wrong and people are depending on you. His eyes found Chin's in the classroom audience, and she understood that his comment was directed specifically toward her situation and the lessons she'd learned during the previous week's training. Physical strength matters, Washington continued, but it's not the only thing that matters. Intelligence, determination, teamwork, and the ability to function under pressure. Those qualities often make the difference between mission success and failure. The remainder of Chin's advanced individual training proceeded with challenges that tested different aspects of military competence. Marksmanship, where her smaller frame actually provided advantages in stability and precision. Communications equipment operation, where her technical background translated directly to military applications. Medical training, where attention to detail mattered more than physical strength. By graduation, Chin had established herself as a competent soldier who contributed to unit effectiveness through capabilities that complemented rather than competed with her colleagues' strengths. She hadn't become physically equivalent to the larger members of her platoon, but she had proven that military service could accommodate different types of competence without compromising standards or mission requirements. Private First Class Chun, Staff Sergeant Washington said during the graduation ceremony, "You have demonstrated that determination and intelligence can overcome apparent physical limitations. You've earned your place in this unit and in the Army." The recognition meant more than any accommodation or lowered standard could have provided. Chin had succeeded not because expectations were adjusted to her capabilities, but because she had found ways to meet expectations that initially seemed impossible. Years later, as Sergeant Chin prepared her own soldiers for deployment, she would remember the lessons learned during that brutal week at Fort Hood. Physical capability mattered in military service, but it wasn't the only measure of a soldier's worth. Determination, intelligence, teamwork, and the willingness to exceed personal limitations often proved more valuable than raw strength when missions required diverse skills and sustained effort under pressure. The sandbag carry had become a story told throughout her unit, not as an example of someone overcoming limitations, but as a demonstration of what soldiers could accomplish when they refused to accept failure as inevitable. It represented the principle that military service was ultimately about serving something larger than individual comfort or convenience, and that true strength came from the willingness to continue when stopping would be easier. In combat operations years later, Chin would discover that the lessons learned during advanced individual training had prepared her for challenges that no amount of physical conditioning could have addressed. Leadership under pressure, problem-solving when standard solutions failed, and the ability to maintain unit cohesion when everything went wrong. These capabilities had been developed through training experiences that tested determination rather than just physical fitness. Staff Sergeant Washington's applause had acknowledged more than one soldier's successful completion of a difficult exercise. It had recognized the principle that military excellence comes in many forms, and that institutions grow stronger when they find ways to utilize diverse talents rather than demanding conformity to narrow definitions of capability. The story of Private Chin's week at Fort Hood would be retold countless times throughout her military career, but not as a feel-good narrative about overcoming obstacles. Instead, it became an example of how proper standards, fairly applied, could reveal strengths that weren't apparent through conventional assessment methods. For Chin herself, the experience established a foundation of confidence that no subsequent challenge could shake. She had learned that success in military service, like success in any demanding endeavor, required the willingness to attempt things that seemed impossible and to continue when initial attempts failed. The applause had lasted only a few seconds, but its impact resonated throughout her career as a reminder that recognition earned through genuine achievement carried weight that accommodation or sympathy never could. She had proven herself not by lowering standards, but by finding ways to meet them, and that accomplishment became the foundation for everything that followed. In the end, Private Chin's story represented something more significant than individual triumph over physical limitations. It demonstrated the military's capacity to recognize and develop different types of strength, and the importance of maintaining standards that challenged everyone to exceed their apparent capabilities rather than accepting limitations as permanent constraints. The sandbag still weighed 200 pounds, the distance still measured a quarter-mile, and the standards remained unchanged. But Chun had learned that strength could be measured in different ways, and that determination could overcome obstacles that initially seemed insurmountable when the mission was important enough to justify the effort required for success. 2 years later, Staff Sergeant Washington would find himself training another platoon with another soldier who didn't fit the conventional mold. Private Williams, a former accountant who'd enlisted at 35 and struggled with the physical demands of military service. As Washington watched Williams struggle through the same obstacles that had challenged Chun, he remembered the lesson learned from that sweltering day at Fort Hood. Williams, Washington called during a particularly difficult rope climb exercise, "What matters isn't how fast you get to the top. What matters is that you keep trying until you succeed." The young private, though chronologically older than most of his peers, nodded and reset his grip on the rope. Around him, other soldiers had begun to gather, not to mock his struggles, but to offer encouragement and advice. The culture within Echo Company had evolved over the years, influenced by examples like Chin's demonstration that persistence could overcome apparent limitations. "Remember your technique," called Sergeant Chun herself, now returned to Fort Hood as an instructor after completing her initial assignment. "Use your legs to support your weight, not just your arms." The presence of Chun as a training cadre member sent a powerful message to new soldiers about the possibilities that existed within military service. Her success hadn't been achieved through accommodation or lowered standards, but through determination and the development of skills that complemented her physical capabilities. Williams completed the rope climb on his 4th attempt, his face flushed with effort, but carrying the satisfaction that came from genuine achievement. The applause that followed was spontaneous and heartfelt, recognizing not just individual success but the broader principle that military service offered opportunities for growth that extended beyond conventional expectations. "Outstanding effort," Williams, Washington acknowledged, making notes on his assessment clipboard. "That's the kind of determination that builds strong units." As training progressed, Williams discovered what Chun had learned years earlier. That success in military service required the willingness to attempt things that seemed impossible and to continue when initial efforts failed. Physical fitness remained important, but it was only one component of effective military performance. During tactical exercises, Williams' analytical background proved invaluable in planning and logistics. His attention to detail, developed through years of financial work, translated directly to equipment maintenance and supply management. Most importantly, his refusal to quit despite obvious physical disadvantages inspired other soldiers to push beyond their own perceived limitations. "The thing about units that work," Chin explained to a group of new instructors during a professional development session, "is that they're built on complementary strengths rather than identical capabilities. Everyone brings something different to the mission." Her perspective had been shaped not just by her own experiences, but by years of observing how diverse talents contributed to military effectiveness. The soldiers who succeeded weren't necessarily the ones who excelled at every individual task, but those who found ways to contribute meaningfully to collective success. The training philosophy at Fort Hood had evolved to reflect these insights. Physical standards remained demanding and non-negotiable, but instruction methods had been adapted to help different types of soldiers find ways to meet those standards rather than simply identifying who could and couldn't perform specific tasks. Chin's approach, Washington explained to visiting officers from other training installations, isn't about lowering standards or making accommodations. It's about teaching soldiers that there are multiple paths to achieving the same objectives. The sandbag carry exercise remained part of the training curriculum, but it was now preceded by instruction on technique, teamwork, and mental preparation that helped soldiers understand how to approach challenges that exceeded their individual capabilities. The emphasis had shifted from identifying physical limitations to developing strategies for overcoming them. Private Martinez, a recent addition to Echo Company, struggled with the same obstacles that had challenged Chin years earlier. But unlike Chin's experience, Martinez found himself surrounded by instructors and peers who understood that apparent limitations could be overcome through proper training and determination. "The secret," Chin told Martinez during individual coaching, "isn't to become someone you're not. It's to become the best version of who you are and find ways to contribute that authentically to the mission. Martinez nodded, though his expression still carried the uncertainty that characterized soldiers who weren't sure they belonged in military service. Ma'am, what if my best isn't good enough? What if I'm just not cut out for this? Then you'll discover reserves of strength you didn't know you possessed, Chun replied, remembering her own doubts during those first brutal days of training. But you won't discover them by giving up before you've truly tested your limits. The conversation took place on the same loading dock where Chun had first collapsed after completing the sandbag carry, and the physical reminder of her own journey added weight to her words. The location had become something of a landmark within the company, a place where struggling soldiers could see tangible evidence that apparent impossibilities could be overcome through sustained effort. Martinez attempted the full training course the following day, and like Chun before him, he failed several individual obstacles while demonstrating the kind of determination that ultimately mattered more than immediate success. His struggles with the rope climb and wall obstacles were offset by strong performance in technical exercises and tactical problem-solving. Better, Washington acknowledged as Martinez completed the final exercise, exhausted but still standing. You're beginning to understand what this training is really about. The assessment reflected a training philosophy that had been refined through years of working with soldiers like Chun, Williams, and Martinez. Individuals who challenged conventional assumptions about military capability while demonstrating alternative forms of strength that contributed to unit effectiveness. Staff Sergeant Washington had learned to recognize potential that wasn't immediately obvious through physical performance alone. His role as an instructor had evolved from identifying who could and couldn't meet standards to helping every soldier find ways to contribute meaningfully to military service. The best units I served with in combat, Washington told his current training class, weren't composed of soldiers who were all identical in their capabilities. They were teams where different strengths complemented each other and everyone understood their role in achieving mission success. His perspective had been shaped by deployments where technical expertise, analytical thinking, communication skills, and determination under pressure proved as valuable as raw physical strength. The training program at Fort Hood now reflected that understanding, challenging soldiers in multiple dimensions rather than focusing exclusively on conventional fitness assessments. Chin's story had become part of the unofficial curriculum at Fort Hood, retold not as inspiration, but as practical example of how military service could accommodate different types of excellence without compromising standards. New instructors learned her approach to coaching struggling soldiers, while new recruits heard her story as evidence that success was possible regardless of initial disadvantages. The point isn't that anyone can do anything, Chin clarified during training sessions where her story was referenced. The point is that everyone can find ways to contribute if they're willing to work hard enough and think creatively about how to apply their strengths. Her emphasis on realistic assessment combined with maximum effort had proven effective with successive groups of soldiers who might otherwise have been discouraged by early struggles. The training environment at Fort Hood had become more supportive without becoming less demanding, creating conditions where diverse talents could be developed and utilized. Years after her own graduation, Chun continued to receive updates from soldiers she'd helped train, many of whom had gone on to successful military careers in various specialties. Their achievements validated the principle that proper training could reveal capabilities that weren't apparent through conventional assessment methods. Private Thompson, now Sergeant Thompson, had become a communications specialist whose analytical skills proved invaluable during complex operations. Private Rodriguez had discovered aptitude for logistics management that made him essential to unit planning and resource allocation. Each success story reinforced the understanding that military service offered multiple paths to meaningful contribution. The transformation of training philosophy at Fort Hood hadn't gone unnoticed by higher military leadership. Other installations began requesting guidance on implementing similar approaches, recognizing that effective training needed to develop diverse capabilities rather than producing identical soldiers. What we've learned, Washington reported during a conference of military educators, is that the best way to maintain high standards is to give every soldier multiple opportunities to demonstrate their potential rather than making final judgments based on limited assessment criteria. The approach required more individual attention and creative instruction methods, but it resulted in higher graduation rates and better long-term performance among soldiers who might otherwise have been unsuccessful in military service. The investment in comprehensive training produced better units and more effective military personnel. Chen's influence extended beyond individual soldiers to the broader culture of military training and development. Her example had demonstrated that apparent limitations could be overcome through proper support and sustained effort, leading to changes in how instructors approached their responsibilities and how standards were interpreted and applied. The strongest military, Chen observed during a presentation to civilian educators, isn't necessarily composed of the physically strongest individuals. It's composed of people who understand their role in achieving collective objectives and who have been properly trained to fulfill those responsibilities regardless of their individual limitations. Her perspective reflected years of experience in both training and operational environments, where diverse capabilities had proven essential to mission success. The lessons learned at Fort Hood had applications beyond military service, demonstrating how institutions could maintain high standards while developing different types of excellence. The sandbag still weighed 200 pounds, the obstacles remained physically demanding, and graduation standards continued to challenge every soldier who attempted to meet them. But the training environment had evolved to help more people succeed through better instruction, clearer understanding of objectives, and recognition that strength could be measured and developed in multiple ways. As Chun prepared for her next assignment, she reflected on the unexpected directions that a single moment of determination could create. Her decision to complete the sandbag carry despite obvious physical disadvantages had influenced not just her own career, but the entire approach to military training at one of the Army's most important installations. The applause from Staff Sergeant Washington had lasted only a few seconds, but its impact continued to resonate through the careers of countless soldiers who had benefited from the training philosophy that emerged from that moment of recognition. Chun had proven that determination could overcome apparent limitations, and that proof had become the foundation for helping others discover their own unexpected capabilities. The story continued to evolve with each new group of soldiers who faced similar challenges and found similar success through the application of lessons learned from Chen's example. Military service remained demanding and unforgiving, but it had also become more accessible to people who brought different types of strength to the institution's mission of national defense. 5 years after her initial training at Fort Hood, Master Sergeant Chen found herself assigned to the Army's Training and Doctrine Command, tasked with developing new approaches to military education that could be implemented across all service branches. Her office walls were lined with commendations and photographs from various assignments, but the image that drew most visitors' attention was a simple snapshot of a muddy soldier dragging a sandbag across a finish line while a drill sergeant applauded in the background. That photograph represents the moment everything changed, Chen would explain to visitors who asked about its significance. Not just for me personally, but for how we think about developing military capability in people who don't fit conventional expectations. The Training and Doctrine Command had recruited Chen specifically because of her reputation for working successfully with struggling soldiers while maintaining rigorous standards. Her methods had been documented and studied, leading to formal adoption of techniques that emphasized individual coaching combined with demanding collective requirements. The principle is simple, Chen explained during a briefing to senior military educators from across the Department of Defense. Every person has the potential to contribute meaningfully to military service, but not everyone will contribute in identical ways. Our job as trainers is to help people discover and develop their unique capabilities rather than trying to make everyone identical. Her presentation included case studies from her years at Fort Hood, carefully anonymized but demonstrating the range of challenges that soldiers brought to military service and the various approaches that had proven effective in helping them succeed. The data showed measurably improved retention rates, higher performance scores, and better unit cohesion when training emphasized individual development within collective standards. Sergeant Chen's approach, noted General Patricia Morrison, the commanding officer for Training and Doctrine Command, represents evolution rather than revolution in military training. We're not lowering standards or making accommodations. We're becoming more sophisticated in how we help people meet standards that remain appropriately demanding. The distinction was crucial for maintaining credibility within military culture, where any suggestion of reduced expectations could undermine the entire training program. Chen's success had been built on proving that different approaches could lead to the same high-level outcomes, not on arguing that outcomes should be adjusted to match capabilities. During her tenure with Training and Doctrine Command, Chen had the opportunity to visit military installations worldwide, observing training programs and sharing insights gained from her experiences at Fort Hood. Each visit reinforced her understanding that the challenges she'd faced weren't unique to American military service or to female soldiers specifically. At the British Army's training facility in Catterick, she met Lieutenant Sarah Williams, a former university professor who'd enlisted at age 32 and struggled with the physical demands of infantry training. Williams' experience paralleled Chen's own journey, though the cultural context and specific challenges differed significantly. The doubt is the same everywhere, Williams confided during a private conversation after Chen's presentation to British training staff. People look at me and see someone who doesn't belong, someone who's going to fail or get others hurt because I can't match the physical performance of 20-year-old male soldiers. Chen nodded, recognizing the universal nature of the challenge. What did you discover about yourself during the most difficult parts of training? Williams considered the question carefully. That I was stronger than I thought, but not in the ways I expected. I couldn't outrun or outlift in the other soldiers, but I could outthink them sometimes, and I never stopped trying even when everything hurt. And your instructors? Chen asked. How did they respond to your persistence? Like your staff Sergeant Washington, Williams replied with a smile. Initially skeptical, then increasingly supportive as they realized I wasn't going to quit or accept reduced expectations. By graduation, they were using my example to motivate other struggling soldiers. The conversation reinforced Chen's understanding that effective military training required instructors who could recognize different types of strength while maintaining consistent standards for everyone. The challenge wasn't identifying who could and couldn't meet requirements, but helping everyone find ways to meet requirements that honored the institution's mission. At the German Bundeswehr training facility in Hammelburg, Chen observed similar dynamics with different cultural expressions. German military culture emphasized technical competence and systematic problem-solving, creating an environment where analytical skills were valued alongside physical capability. Nevertheless, soldiers who didn't match conventional expectations still faced skepticism and doubt that paralleled her own early experiences. The universal element, Chen noted in her report to Training and Doctrine Command, is that military service everywhere demands capabilities that go beyond what civilian life typically requires. The specific challenges vary, but the fundamental need for training that develops diverse strengths while maintaining rigorous standards appears consistent across different military cultures. Her international observations informed recommendations for improving American military training programs, particularly in areas where other countries had developed innovative approaches to common challenges. The German emphasis on technical education, the British focus on leadership development, and the Australian integration of indigenous tracking skills all offered insights that could enhance American military education. Back at Fort Hood, Staff Sergeant Washington had been promoted to Sergeant First Class and given responsibility for training drill sergeants who would work with recruits throughout the Army. His curriculum emphasized the lessons learned from working with soldiers like Chun, Williams, Martinez, and countless others who had challenged conventional assumptions about military capability. The most important thing I can teach you, Washington told his classes of prospective drill sergeants, is how to recognize potential that isn't immediately obvious. Some of your best soldiers will be people who struggle initially, but demonstrate the kind of determination that ultimately matters more than natural athletic ability. His training program included practical exercises where instructor candidates worked with actors portraying different types of struggling recruits, learning to provide appropriate support and encouragement while maintaining standards that honored military service. The scenarios were based on real situations that Washington and other experienced instructors had encountered, providing realistic preparation for challenges they would face in their own training assignments. Remember, Washington emphasized, your job isn't to make everyone identical. Your job is to help everyone become the best soldier they can be within the requirements that military service demands. Sometimes that means pushing people beyond what they think they can accomplish. One of Washington's students, Staff Sergeant Jennifer Martinez, had herself been one of Chin's early success stories at Fort Hood. Her progression from struggling recruit to effective instructor demonstrated the long-term impact of training approaches that emphasized individual development within collective standards. When I was going through initial training, Martinez shared with her own students, I thought success meant matching the performance of the strongest, fastest soldiers in my unit. I learned that success actually meant finding ways to contribute meaningfully to mission accomplishment, which sometimes required different strengths than pure athletic ability. Her perspective had been shaped not just by her own experiences, but by years of working with diverse groups of soldiers who brought various backgrounds and capabilities to military service. The training environment she created emphasized mutual support and collective achievement rather than individual competition, leading to higher success rates and better unit cohesion. The influence of Chin's example had spread beyond formal training programs to operational units, where her former students now served as leaders. Lieutenant Colonel Thompson, formerly Private Thompson from Chin's early days at Fort Hood, commanded a logistics battalion where diverse capabilities were essential to mission success. Sergeant Chin taught me that military service isn't about being the strongest or fastest person in the unit, Thompson explained to his subordinate leaders during a professional development session. It's about understanding your role in achieving collective objectives and executing that role with competence and dedication regardless of your individual limitations. His battalion consistently received high ratings for efficiency and effectiveness, attributed in part to leadership approaches that emphasize developing individual strengths within collective requirements. The soldiers under his command understood that everyone was expected to contribute meaningfully, but that meaningful contribution could take different forms depending on individual capabilities and unit needs. Major Rodriguez, another of Chin's former students, had become a career counselor specializing in helping soldiers identify military occupational specialties that matched their interests and abilities. Her approach emphasized comprehensive assessment that considered multiple factors rather than relying exclusively on initial fitness evaluations. The military offers hundreds of different career fields, Rodriguez explained to new recruits during orientation sessions. Success in military service often depends more on finding the right match between your capabilities and military requirements than on trying to force yourself into roles that don't utilize your strengths effectively. Her counseling methods had been influenced by Chin's example of finding ways to contribute authentically rather than trying to become someone she wasn't. The guidance Rodriguez provided helped soldiers make informed decisions about their military careers while understanding that success would require sustained effort regardless of their chosen specialty. The cumulative impact of these individual success stories had influenced military culture more broadly, creating an environment where diverse capabilities were better recognized and utilized. Training programs throughout the Army had adopted elements of the approach pioneered at Fort Hood, leading to improved outcomes for soldiers who might previously have been unsuccessful in military service. What we've learned, noted General Morrison during a conference on military human resources, is that effective military organizations are built on complementary strengths rather than identical capabilities. Our training programs need to reflect that, understanding while maintaining the standards that ensure military effectiveness. The policy changes that emerged from this understanding included modified assessment criteria that considered multiple dimensions of military potential, enhanced instructor training that emphasized individual coaching within collective standards, and career development programs that helped soldiers find appropriate matches between their capabilities and military requirements. Chin's role at Training and Doctrine Command involved implementing these changes across multiple installations, working with local commanders and training staff to adapt general principles to specific contexts and requirements. Each implementation required careful attention to maintaining military culture while introducing approaches that better developed diverse talents. The key, Chin observed during one such implementation visit, is demonstrating that new approaches produce better outcomes rather than asking people to change because change is inherently good. Military culture values results, so improvements need to be measured and documented rather than simply advocated. Her implementation strategy emphasized pilot programs that could demonstrate effectiveness before broader adoption, allowing skeptical commanders to see evidence of improved outcomes before committing to significant changes in their training programs. The approach had proven successful across multiple installations and service branches. At the Air Force Academy, Chun worked with Colonel Sarah Davidson to implement modified approaches to physical training that emphasized technique and determination alongside raw athletic ability. The changes didn't alter graduation requirements, but provided better instruction and support for cadets who struggled with conventional training methods. "We're not lowering standards," Davidson explained to faculty members who expressed concerns about the modifications. "We're becoming more effective at helping people meet standards that remain appropriately challenging. The goal is developing better officers, not making officer development easier." The results included higher graduation rates, improved cadet morale, and better long-term performance among graduates who had utilized the enhanced training approaches. The success validated Chin's principle that better instruction could help more people succeed without compromising the standards that ensured military effectiveness. At the Naval Academy, similar implementations focused on leadership development and teamwork skills that complemented physical training. The approach recognized that naval service required diverse capabilities, with different specialties demanding different combinations of technical, physical, and leadership skills. Midshipman Chin's story, noted Admiral Roberts during a faculty meeting, reminds us that the officers we're developing will face challenges that require multiple types of strength. Our training needs to develop all of those capabilities rather than focusing exclusively on any single dimension. The Naval Academy's adaptation of Chin's principles emphasized integration of different training elements rather than treating physical, academic, and leadership development as separate components. The approach produced officers who understood how different capabilities contributed to overall effectiveness and who could utilize diverse talents within their own commands. Marine Corps training at Parris Island presented unique challenges because of the service's culture and the specific demands of amphibious warfare. However, even within that context, Chin's principles found application in helping recruits understand how determination and teamwork could overcome individual limitations. The Marine Corps has always valued fighting spirit over physical advantages, noted Gunnery Sergeant Williams during discussions about implementing enhanced training approaches. What Sergeant Chin's example provides is better methods for developing that fighting spirit in people who might not display it immediately. The adaptations for Marine Corps training emphasized mental toughness and unit cohesion while maintaining the demanding physical standards that Marine culture required. The approach helped more recruits succeed in earning the title Marine, while ensuring that success represented genuine achievement rather than reduced expectations. Throughout these implementations, Chun continued to encounter soldiers whose experiences paralleled her own journey from struggling recruit to effective military professional. Each interaction reinforced her understanding that the challenges she'd faced weren't unique, and that the solutions developed at Fort Hood had broader applicability. Private Lisa Chong, struggling through Army basic training at Fort Benning, represented the latest iteration of challenges that Chun had first encountered years earlier. Chang's background as a software engineer provided analytical skills that translated well to technical aspects of military training, but her small stature and limited athletic experience created difficulties with physical requirements. "Ma'am," Chong said during a private conversation after Chin's presentation to Fort Benning training staff, "Everyone keeps telling me that I should consider transferring to a less physically demanding military occupation. But I enlisted for infantry training specifically because I wanted to prove that I could handle the most challenging assignments." Chun smiled, recognizing the same determination that had driven her own persistence through difficult training. "What's your biggest concern about the physical requirements?" "That I'll fail and validate everyone's assumptions about people like me," Chong replied honestly. "Or that I'll succeed only because instructors make accommodations that compromise the standards other soldiers have to meet." Both concerns are valid, Chin acknowledged. But there's a third possibility, that you'll succeed by finding ways to meet the same standards everyone else meets, just through different approaches that utilize your specific strengths while developing areas where you need improvement. The conversation continued for over an hour, covering practical strategies for physical training, mental preparation techniques, and approaches to building relationships with fellow soldiers who might initially doubt her capabilities. Chen shared specific examples from her own experience, while emphasizing that Chang's path would necessarily be unique to her own circumstances and capabilities. The most important thing to remember, Chen concluded, is that success in military service isn't about proving you're identical to everyone else. It's about proving you can contribute meaningfully to mission accomplishment regardless of the specific challenges you face along the way. Chang nodded thoughtfully, her expression reflecting the same mixture of determination and uncertainty that Chen remembered from her own early days of training. The conversation represented one more iteration of mentorship relationships that had developed from Chen's original example of persistence in the face of apparent limitations. 6 months later, Chen received an update that Sergeant Chang had successfully completed infantry training and was serving effectively with her assigned unit. The report included commendations for her performance during field exercises and notes about her positive influence on unit morale and cohesion. Another success story, Chen noted in her files, though she understood that each success represented individual achievement rather than validation of any particular training method. The goal wasn't proving that everyone could succeed in military service, but ensuring that everyone who could succeed had appropriate opportunities to demonstrate their capabilities. As Chun prepared for retirement after 22 years of military service, she reflected on the unexpected trajectory that had begun with a moment of determination during a challenging training exercise. Her decision to complete the sandbag carry despite obvious physical disadvantages had influenced not just her own career, but the broader approach to military training and development. The photograph of Staff Sergeant Washington's applause still occupied a prominent place in her office, serving as a reminder that recognition earned through genuine achievement carried weight that accommodation or sympathy never could. The impact of that moment had extended far beyond individual success to influence military culture and training philosophy. The lesson isn't that anyone can do anything, Chen explained during her retirement ceremony, addressing an audience that included soldiers whose careers had been influenced by her example and approach. The lesson is that everyone deserves the opportunity to discover what they're capable of achieving when properly trained and supported. Her final assignment involved documenting the training innovations that had emerged from her experiences, creating resources that could be used by future military educators to continue developing diverse capabilities within demanding standards. The work ensured that lessons learned would survive changes in personnel and leadership. Staff Sergeant Washington, now Sergeant Major Washington, served as the keynote speaker at Chen's retirement ceremony. His remarks focused on the mutual influence that effective soldiers and instructors had on each other, creating cycles of improvement that strengthened military service over time. Master Sergeant Chen taught all of us, Washington observed, that strength comes in many forms, and that our job as military professionals is to recognize and develop all types of strength rather than limiting ourselves to narrow definitions of capability. His words were followed by sustained applause from an audience that included hundreds of soldiers whose careers had been influenced directly or indirectly by the training approaches that Chen's example had inspired. The recognition represented acknowledgement not just of individual achievement, but of broader contributions to military effectiveness and institutional improvement. As Chun transitioned to civilian life, she carried with her the understanding that military service had provided opportunities for growth and contribution that exceeded anything she'd imagined when she first enlisted. The challenges that had initially seemed like obstacles had become foundations for developing capabilities that served not just her own career, but the broader mission of national defense. The sandbag still weighed 200 pounds, the training standards remained demanding, and graduation requirements continued to challenge every soldier who attempted to meet them. But the training environment had evolved to help more people succeed through better instruction, enhanced support, and recognition that determination could overcome apparent limitations when combined with proper preparation and persistent effort. Years later, as Chen worked as a civilian contractor developing training programs for various organizations, she continued to encounter people whose potential exceeded their apparent limitations. The principles she'd learned in military service proved applicable to corporate training, educational development, and community organizations where diverse capabilities needed to be recognized and utilized effectively. The story that had begun with a struggling recruit's refusal to quit had evolved into a comprehensive approach to human development that honored both individual potential and collective requirements. The impact continued to grow through the careers of soldiers who applied similar principles in their own leadership roles, creating expanding circles of influence that strengthened institutions and supported individual achievement. In the end, Chen's legacy wasn't the specific training techniques or policy changes that bore her influence. It was the demonstration that apparent limitations could be overcome through determination, proper support, and institutional wisdom that recognized diverse forms of strength. The applause that had lasted only a few seconds continued to resonate through countless careers and countless moments when people chose persistence over surrender in pursuit of goals that initially seemed impossible to achieve.